There is a comfort we all quietly accept about death. We believe that when the final breath leaves our lungs, the cruelties of this world can no longer touch us. The grave is the ultimate sanctuary, a place where the debts of life are canceled, where enemies can no longer wield their blades, and where the fragile human body is finally granted the dignity of peace. But what happens when the hatred of your enemies is so profound, so utterly consuming, that 6 feet of earth is not enough to stop them? What happens when the men who sought your destruction in life refuse to let you rest in death? The year is 897 AD. The city is Rome. But this is not the Rome of glorious antiquity, of shining marble and stoic philosophers. This is a Rome that has descended into a prolonged, suffocating nightmare. The aqueducts are broken, bleeding stagnant water into the valleys. The great Colosseum is a crumbling shell, overgrown with weeds and shadows. The streets are ruled by vicious aristocratic families who view murder not as a sin, but as a standard political maneuver. And at the very heart of this rotting empire sits the Catholic Church. To be the Pope in the late 9th century was not to be a spiritual shepherd, it was to wear a target on your back. It was a time of poisoned communion wine, of daggers hidden beneath holy vestments, and of pontiffs being beaten to death in the very sanctuaries they had sworn to protect. But out of all the bloodshed, out of all the depravity that stained the cobblestones of the holy city, one event stands alone. An event so grotesque, so deeply blasphemous, that the church itself spent centuries trying to scrub it from the annals of history. It is the story of political paranoia, of unhinged vengeance, and of a man who was dragged from the abyss of death to face the wrath of the living. This is the true story of the Cadaver Synod, the trial of a rotting corpse. To understand the madness that was about to unfold in the Basilica of St. John Lateran, you must first understand the man who would become its silent, decaying centerpiece, Pope Formosus. Formosus was a man of extreme contradictions. He was an ascetic, a man who fasted and prayed with genuine fervor, yet he was also a brilliant, ruthless political strategist. In a time when the lifespan of a pope could be measured in months, Formosus was a survivor. He understood that in Rome, piety was a liability, and power was the only currency that mattered. Before ascending to the papacy, Formosus had made a vast network of powerful friends and an even larger network of lethal enemies. The most dangerous among these enemies was the House of Spoleto, a brutal aristocratic faction led by the terrifyingly ambitious Queen Agiltrude. Agiltrude was a woman whose thirst for control was matched only by her capacity for vengeance. She wanted the Italian peninsula under her family's absolute dominion, and she needed a puppet on the papal throne to legitimize her family's violent conquests. When Formosus was crowned pope in 881, he knew the Spoletans were breathing down his neck. For a time, he played their game. He smiled at their demands. He crowned Agiltrude's son, Lambert, as co-emperor, and he maintained the fragile illusion of obedience. But Formosus was only biding his time. Behind closed doors, in the dimly lit, suffocating corridors of the Lateran Palace, he was sending secret, desperate missives across the Alps. He reached out to Arnulf of Carinthia, a vicious Germanic warlord. Formosus begged Arnulf to march on Rome, to shatter the Spoleto family, and to liberate the papacy from their iron grip. Arnulf answered the call. He marched his armies over the mountains, cutting a bloody swath through Italy. He breached the walls of Rome, sending Queen Agiltrude and her son fleeing for their lives into the countryside. In a grand, triumphant ceremony, Formosus crowned Arnulf as the true emperor. It was a masterstroke of political survival. Formosus had won. He had outmaneuvered the most dangerous family in Italy. But in Rome, victory is always a temporary illusion. Shortly after his triumph, Arnulf was struck by a mysterious, paralyzing illness, forcing his armies to retreat back across the Alps. Formosus was left utterly defenseless. The shield he had summoned had shattered, and in the dark forests outside the city, the house of Spoleto was regrouping, their humiliation fermenting into a blinding, rabid hatred. Before the Spoletans could march back into Rome and exact their bloody revenge, nature intervened. On April 4, 896, Pope Formosus died. The cause of his death remains a mystery. Some say it was a sudden stroke brought on by the crushing stress of his impending doom. Others whisper that a slow-acting poison finally took its toll, slipped into his food by a spy loyal to Agiltrude. Whatever the cause, Formosus was dead. His body was washed, anointed with holy oils, wrapped in the heavy gold-threaded vestments of his office, and laid to rest in a stone sarcophagus within the sacred grounds of St. Peter's Basilica. The heavy marble lid was slid into place, sealing him in darkness. Formosus had escaped. He had played the deadly game of Roman politics, and by dying before his enemies could reach him, he had technically won. The Spoletans had been robbed of their vengeance. Formosus was beyond their reach, untouchable in the realm of the dead. Or so he thought, because the hatred of Queen Agiltrude was a living, breathing entity. And as she marched her forces back into the decaying streets of Rome, she brought with her a terrifying realization. If she could not punish the living man, she would punish his soul, his legacy, and his rotting flesh. With Formosus dead and the Germanic armies gone, the Spoleto family seized Rome by the throat. They quickly installed a pope of their own choosing, but he mysteriously died after just 15 days, likely strangled or poisoned to make way for someone entirely under Agiltrude's control. That someone was Pope Stephen VI. Stephen was not a holy man. He was an ambitious, neurotic cleric who owed everything to the House of Spoleto. He had actually been consecrated as a bishop by Formosus years earlier, a fact that now gnawed at his conscience and threatened his legitimacy. If Formosus was an illegitimate pope, as the Spoletans claimed, then Stephen's own rise to power was built on a foundation of sand. Agiltrude knew this, and she weaponized Stephen's paranoia. She whispered in his ear in the dark corners of the Vatican. She demanded that the reign of Formosus be completely eradicated from history. His laws must be reversed, his ordinations must be invalidated. But medieval law required a trial. A man could not be legally condemned, nor his acts annulled, without facing a judge, hearing the charges against him, and being given a chance to defend himself. It was an impossible legal hurdle. How do you put a dead man on trial? The answer that emerged from the twisted minds of Stephen VI and Queen Agiltrude was an idea so deeply unnatural that even the hardened killers of the Roman aristocracy shuddered at the thought of it. They would exhume the body. They would bring the corpse to court. It had been 7 months since Formosus died,
7 months inside a damp, suffocating stone box. In January of 897, under the cover of a moonless night, Pope Stephen VI gave the horrifying order. A detachment of guards, accompanied by terrified gravediggers, descended into the catacombs beneath St. Peter's Basilica. The air in the catacombs was thick, tasting of dust, old incense, and the sweet, sickly scent of decay. Imagine being one of those men, holding a flickering torch, the flames casting long, dancing shadows across the ancient stones. You hear the grinding, heavy scrape of crowbars wedged beneath the marble lid of the tomb. You feel the cold sweat on your neck. You know that breaking the seal of a papal tomb is a damnable offense, a sin that could drag your soul straight to hell. But the wrath of the living pope is much more immediate than the wrath of God. With a sickening crack, the marble lid is pushed aside.
The stench hits them instantly, a physical, suffocating wave of putrefaction that forces the men to violently gag, dropping their tools as they stagger back. Inside the tomb, the darkness clings to the body of Pope Formosus. 7 months in the damp Roman earth is a horrific catalyst. The body is no longer human, but it is not yet dust. It is in the most grotesque stage of decomposition. The skin has turned a mottled, bruised black, drawn tight over the skull, peeling back to reveal a rictus grin. The eyes have long since liquefied, leaving behind hollow, staring cavities. The beautiful gold-embroidered vestments are now stained with the black fluids of decay, adhering to the rotting flesh beneath. But the orders were absolute. Swallowing their bile, the guards reach into the sarcophagus. They wrap their hands around the rigid, decomposing limbs of the former pontiff. The sound of dry, snapping joints echoes through the crypt as they brutally haul the body out of its resting place. They do not place him in a coffin. He is a prisoner now. They drag him up the stone steps, his mummified heels thumping against the ancient stairs. They carry him through the empty, silent streets of Rome. The greatest city on earth is dead quiet, as if holding its breath as this macabre procession makes its way to the Basilica of St. John Lateran. When they arrive, the true horror of their preparations begins. Stephen VI had ordered that the corpse be treated exactly like a living defendant, but with the twisted pageantry of a papal ceremony. In the dim candlelight of the basilica's antechamber, the shivering attendants strip the corpse of its burial shrouds. The decayed flesh sloughs off onto the cold floor. They force the stiff, unyielding arms of the dead man into the grand, heavy robes of the papacy. They drape him in silk and velvet. They force a glittering, jewel-encrusted tiara onto his collapsing skull. They place the heavy pastoral staff into his skeletal fingers. The contrast is unbearable. The highest symbols of divine earthly power draped over a festering, rotting heap of meat and bone. And then, the heavy wooden doors of the great basilica are pushed open. Inside, the highest-ranking officials of the Catholic Church, bishops, cardinals, and priests are sitting in absolute, paralyzed silence. They have been ordered to attend under threat of death. They stare, wide-eyed and trembling, as the corpse of Pope Formosus is carried down the center aisle. The body is hoisted up onto a magnificent wooden throne. It slumps instantly, gravity pulling the decaying head to the side, the jeweled crown slipping precariously over the eyeless sockets. Standing before the altar, trembling with a mixture of manic rage and creeping terror, is Pope Stephen VI. The trial of the dead is about to begin. Look at the scene inside the Basilica of St. John Lateran. Hold it in your mind. It is the dead of winter. The massive stone walls of the church radiate a bone-deep, biting cold, but the air inside is heavy, suffocatingly thick. Dozens of censers are swinging from the hands of trembling acolytes, billowing massive clouds of choking, sweet frankincense. They are burning as much resin as they possibly can, but it is entirely useless. The overwhelming, wretched stench of the rotting corpse on the throne cuts through the holy incense like a butcher's knife. The highest clergy in the Western world are seated in a grand semicircle. These are hardened men, political survivors, veterans of Rome's bloody intrigues. But tonight, their eyes are wide with an infantile, paralyzing terror. They sit perfectly rigid. No one whispers, no one dares to cough. To move is to draw the attention of Pope Stephen VI, who is pacing furiously before the altar like a rabid dog. And there, slumped on the papal throne, sits the defendant, Pope Formosus. His head lolled sickeningly against the high wooden backrest of the chair. The glittering crown rests crookedly on a skull that is peeling away in strips of blackened leather. The flickering candlelight plays cruel tricks on the eyes of the assembly. As the tall flames dance in the draughts of the cavernous hall, the shadows shift across the corpse's hollowed, sunken face, making it appear as though the dead man's jaw is moving, as though he is sneering at his accusers. But medieval ecclesiastical law was absolute. A defendant could not merely sit in silence. He had to speak. He had to enter a plea. He had to defend himself. Since the throat of Formosus was nothing but dry dust and decayed cartilage, Pope Stephen provided him with a voice. A young deacon, barely 18 years old, was dragged from the ranks of the junior clergy and forced to stand directly beside the rotting corpse. His strict orders were to answer on behalf of the dead pope. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated psychological torture inflicted upon this boy. He was commanded to press his body against a festering, putrefying cadaver, breathing in the miasma of death, knowing that a single misspoken word could result in his own execution. He stood there, shaking so violently that the heavy wooden throne rattled against the stone floor. The trial began. Pope Stephen VI did not conduct a legal proceeding. He unleashed an exorcism of his own paranoid madness. He marched up to the throne, his face flushed purple with rage, the veins bulging in his neck. He pointed a trembling, accusing finger directly into the empty, liquefied eye sockets of Formosus. His voice echoed through the vaulted ceilings, a piercing, hysterical shriek. "When you were Bishop of Porto, why did you usurp the universal Roman See in such a spirit of ambition?" The silence that followed was the most terrifying sound in the world. The living pope, dripping in jewels and fine silks, screaming at a pile of rotting meat wrapped in gold. The entire basilica held its breath. Stephen glared at the young deacon, the boy weeping silently, his knees buckling under the weight of his own terror, forced himself to speak the words he had been instructed to say. "Because I was evil," the boy stammered, his voice cracking, echoing pitifully in the vast silence. Stephen fed off it. The madness escalated. He berated the corpse for perjury. He accused Formosus of violating sacred church canon, of abandoning his previous bishopric to lust after the papacy.
He screamed questions, paced away, then spun back around to scream again, hurling insults at the unblinking, decaying face of his predecessor. Whenever Stephen paused, he demanded an answer, and every time the weeping deacon would lean out from behind the stench of the corpse and confess to the sins. It was a kangaroo court summoned from the depths of hell. The clergy watching this spectacle were entirely complicit in their silence. They knew that Formosus was innocent of these specific ecclesiastical charges. They knew this was a political theater orchestrated by Queen Ageltrude to legitimize her family's violent rule. But to speak up, to raise an objection on behalf of a dead man, meant joining him in the earth. So the cardinals and bishops stared at the floor, sweating in the freezing air, praying only for it to end. Finally, after hours of screaming, of pacing, of interrogating a man who had been dead for nearly a year, Pope Stephen rendered his verdict. Guilty. Guilty of perjury. Guilty of coveting the papal throne. Guilty of illegitimacy. Stephen formally pronounced that the papacy of Formosus was entirely invalid. He was never a true pope. Therefore, every single act he had ever committed, every law he had passed, and most importantly, every bishop he had ordained, was instantly null and void. With that single decree, Pope Stephen achieved his goal. By invalidating Formosus, Stephen wiped out his own previous ordinations, removing the legal hurdles that threatened his own grip on the papal throne. The politics were settled. The trial was over. The verdict had been cast. But Pope Stephen was not finished. The legal victory was not enough to satisfy the bloodlust of the House of Spoleto. The dead man had been convicted. Now the dead man had to be punished.
The term is damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, a practice dating back to the cruelest emperors of ancient Rome, where a person is not just killed but erased from existence, their statues smashed, their names chiseled off stone monuments, their legacy utterly obliterated. Stephen intended to erase Formosus, but first he had to unmake him. Stephen gave a sharp, vicious nod to his guards. 3 large, heavily armed men stepped up to the papal throne. The assembly of bishops watched in muted horror as the guards grabbed the corpse. The heavy, jewel-encrusted tiara was violently yanked from the dead man's head, taking a sickening patch of blackened scalp and brittle hair with it. They stripped him. They tore the sacred pallium from his shoulders. They ripped the golden vestments from his body. Because the fabrics had adhered to the decomposing flesh, the sound of the tearing silk was accompanied by the wet, grotesque sounds of tearing skin. The body of Formosus began to fall apart on the throne. Once the corpse was stripped down to the coarse hair shirt Formosus wore in his ascetic life, a man stepped forward, holding a heavy, rusted iron blade. In the Catholic faith, the 3 fingers of the right hand, the thumb, the index, and the middle finger, are sacred. They are the fingers used to form the Holy Trinity. They are the fingers used to administer blessings, to consecrate the host, to perform the highest miracles of the faith. The guard took hold of the dead man's rigid right arm. He pinned the brittle, blackened hand flat against the wooden armrest of the throne. He raised the blade. A heavy, wet crunch echoed through the basilica. The 3 blessing fingers of Pope Formosus were severed from his hand. They rolled off the armrest, dropping onto the cold stone floor with a dull, hollow tapping sound.
A collective gasp shuddered through the watching clergy. This was beyond politics. This was a desecration of the sacred. This was a profound and unforgivable blasphemy. But Stephen was smiling. He ordered the guards to dress the mutilated corpse in the filthy, lice-ridden rags of a beggar. The corpse was violently shoved off the throne. It hit the floor with a heavy, sickening thud, limbs splaying in unnatural, broken angles. Ropes were hastily tied around the dead man's ankles. The great doors of the basilica were thrown wide open. The trial was concluded, but the spectacle was moving into the streets. Outside, a mob of Romans had been carefully whipped into a frenzy by Agiltrude's agents. They had been drinking, screaming, waiting in the freezing dark for the verdict. When the guards dragged the rotting, mutilated body of Formosus out of the church, the mob descended like a pack of starving wolves. They seized the ropes. They dragged the body of the former pope through the dirt and cobblestones of Rome. They howled in the darkness, throwing stones, kicking the mummified flesh, spitting on the ruined face of the man who had once been their spiritual father.
Through the winding, decaying streets they ran, dragging the corpse behind them. The friction of the jagged Roman roads tore away what little flesh remained. By the time the mob reached the banks of the Tiber River, the body was practically a ruined, shattered skeleton, barely held together by dry sinew and the filthy rags it had been forced into. With a final, triumphant roar, the mob swung the corpse back and forth, building momentum. They hurled Pope Formosus into the freezing, rushing black waters of the Tiber River. In ancient Rome, throwing a body into the Tiber was the ultimate insult, reserved only for the most reviled traitors and murderers. It meant the denial of a burial. It meant the soul would wander for eternity, lost and unanchored. The corpse splashed into the dark water, instantly swallowed by the heavy, churning currents. It vanished into the abyss. Stephen VI returned to his chambers in the Lateran Palace, flushed with victory. He had done it. He had pleased his masters. He had solidified his power. He had destroyed the legacy of his predecessor and asserted his absolute dominance over the city of Rome. But there is a fatal flaw in the arrogance of men who believe they can command the dead. They forget that there are forces in this world far older and far less forgiving than political ambition. Scarcely had the body of Formosus disappeared beneath the waters of the Tiber when a low, terrifying rumble began to vibrate through the bedrock of Rome. The heavy stone pillars of the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the very room where the trial had just taken place, began to groan. The earth beneath the city was violently convulsing. An earthquake, sudden, violent, and utterly devastating, tore through Rome. Inside the basilica, the terrified clergy watched in absolute despair as the vaulted ceilings fractured. Massive blocks of masonry tore loose from the roof, plummeting into the nave. The altar was crushed. The papal throne was buried in rubble. Half of the great basilica, the mother church of all Christendom, catastrophically collapsed in a blinding cloud of dust and debris. To the people of Rome, it was not a tectonic shift. It was not a natural disaster. It was a divine manifestation of God's absolute wrath. The heavens had witnessed the blasphemy of the cadaver synod, and the judgment of the Almighty was falling upon the city. The mob that had cheered the defilement of the corpse suddenly fell silent, staring at the collapsed roof of their holiest site.
The fear that had paralyzed the clergy now bled out into the streets, infecting every man, woman, and child in Rome. The atmosphere in the city shifted overnight. The triumph of Pope Stephen VI evaporated, replaced by a creeping, suffocating paranoia. Because the dead, it seemed, were not finished speaking, and the Tiber River, swollen with winter rains, was about to surrender its secrets.
The earthquake shattered more than just the stone pillars of St. John Lateran. It shattered the illusion of Pope Stephen's authority. In the immediate aftermath of the collapse, the streets of Rome were gripped by a feral, superstitious panic. The citizens whispered in the alleyways, pointing to the ruined basilica. The message was clear. God was furious. The trial was an abomination. Stephen was not a holy father. He was a monster who had brought a curse upon the eternal city. But whispers alone do not overthrow a pope. The Romans needed a sign. They needed a miracle. And 3 days later, they got one. Miles downstream from the city, a humble hermit was walking along the muddy, reed-choked banks of the Tiber River. The winter storms had caused the river to swell, washing massive amounts of debris onto the shores. As the hermit waded through the freezing shallows, his eyes caught sight of something tangled in the thick, decaying roots of a drowned tree. It was a body, or what was left of one. The corpse was battered, waterlogged, and missing its 3 right fingers. It was wrapped in wet, filthy rags. But the hermit knew exactly who it was. The entire region knew what had been thrown into the river. According to the legends that immediately swept through the city, as the hermit approached the body, a blinding, ethereal light began to emanate from the corpse. The stories claim that when the body was pulled onto the muddy bank, the statues of the saints in a nearby church miraculously bowed their stone heads in reverence to the dead pope. Whether the glowing light and bowing statues were true or simply the desperate embellishments of a terrified populace, it did not matter. The discovery of the body was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Word reached Rome faster than a galloping horse. Formosus has returned. The body had refused to stay at the bottom of the river. The Tiber itself had rejected the sin of Stephen's judgment, spitting the true pope back onto the land to demand justice. When the news reached the Vatican, Pope Stephen VI barricaded himself in the Lateran palace. The arrogance that had fueled his manic screaming at the trial had vanished, replaced by a raw, animalistic terror. He ordered his guards to double their patrols. He sent frantic, begging letters to the House of Spoleto, pleading for military reinforcements. But Ageltrude and her armies were miles away, dealing with their own uprisings. Stephen was completely isolated. Outside the heavy wooden doors of the papal palace, the mob began to gather. But this was not the same mob that had dragged Formosus through the dirt just weeks prior. This mob was not fueled by cheap wine and political bribery. This mob was fueled by righteous, apocalyptic fury. The people of Rome had decided that the only way to appease the wrath of God, the only way to lift the curse that had collapsed their great basilica, was to sacrifice the man who had caused it. In August of 897, just 7 months after the Cadaver Synod, the doors of the Lateran Palace were breached. The scene was pure, terrifying chaos. Hundreds of Romans, armed with torches, pitchforks, and heavy iron hammers, flooded into the palace.
They slaughtered the Swiss guards. They tore down the tapestries, smashed the statues, and surged up the grand staircases, screaming the name of the blasphemer. Pope Stephen VI was found cowering in his private chambers. The man who had dressed a rotting corpse in gold, the man who had screamed at a dead man for hours in a freezing church, was dragged out of his hiding place weeping and begging for his life. The mob stripped him of his papal vestments. They beat him mercilessly in the corridors of his own palace. They dragged him through the same streets where he had ordered the body of Formosus to be dragged. They did not bother with a trial. There were no deacons forced to answer questions, no semicircle of terrified bishops. There was only the brutal, efficient justice of the mob. They hauled Stephen down into the freezing, lightless depths of the Castel Sant'Angelo, a towering cylindrical fortress originally built as the mausoleum for the Emperor Hadrian. They threw him into a damp, windowless dungeon. We do not know exactly how long Stephen sat in the pitch-black darkness of that cell, listening to the dripping water, waiting for his executioners, but we do know how it ended. In the dead of night, assassins descended into the dungeon. They did not use a blade. They did not offer him a final prayer. They wrapped a heavy garrote wire around the neck of Pope Stephen VI, and they strangled him to death in the dark. His eyes bulged, his hands tore at the wire, his heels kicked against the cold stone floor, and then he was gone. The architect of the Cadaver Synod was dead, but the madness he unleashed upon the papacy was only just beginning.
You would think the death of Stephen would bring an end to the nightmare. You would think the church would bury their dead, rebuild their basilica, and beg the world to forget the horrific events of 897. But blood demands blood. And in the late 9th century, Rome was a city addicted to vengeance.
Following Stephen's assassination, the papacy descended into a period of absolute, unprecedented chaos. In the span of just a few years, a rapid succession of popes took the throne, each one violently overturning the decrees of the last, turning the Vatican into a bloody revolving door of political factions. First came Pope Romanus, who lasted a mere 4 months before he was inexplicably deposed and forced into a monastery. Then came Pope Theodore II. He reigned for only 20 days, but in those 20 days, he made a decision that would cement the legacy of Formosus forever. Theodore ordered that the battered, mutilated body of Formosus be brought back to Rome. The scene was the exact inverse of the Cadaver Synod. It was a procession of deep, profound sorrow. The corpse of Formosus, now barely more than a skeleton, was wrapped in the finest, most opulent pontifical robes available. The entire clergy of Rome, weeping and carrying massive beeswax candles, marched behind the body as it was carried back into St. Peter's Basilica. Theodore formally annulled the Cadaver Synod. He declared that Formosus was, and always had been, a true and legitimate pope. The body was laid back into its original stone sarcophagus, the heavy marble lid was sealed, and the pontiff was finally, supposedly, laid to rest. Theodore died a few days later, his mission accomplished. The next pope, John IX, went even further. He held a massive synod, gathering bishops from across the empire, and officially ordered that all records of the Cadaver Synod be burned. He declared that putting a dead man on trial was a grotesque violation of human decency and banned the practice forever. It seemed the nightmare was over. Formosus was vindicated. But history is rarely so kind. because less than a decade later, the Spoleto faction clawed their way back into power, and they installed Pope Sergius III. Sergius III was not just a supporter of the Cadaver Synod. He had been one of the judges sitting in the basilica, watching Stephen scream at the corpse. He hated Formosus with a passion that burned brighter than 1,000 suns. Sergius immediately overturned everything Theodore and John IX had done. He declared that Formosus was, once again, illegitimate. He reaffirmed the guilty verdict of the Cadaver Synod. And according to several historical chronicles from the era, Sergius was so consumed by his hatred that he committed the unthinkable. He ordered the tomb of Pope Formosus to be opened again. More than 8 years had passed since Formosus first died. There was nothing left but dry bones and dust. Yet some historians claim that Sergius had those bones dragged out, placed on the throne, and subjected to a second trial. When he was finished screaming at the skeletal remains, Sergius supposedly ordered the bones to be beheaded and once again thrown into the dark waters of the Tiber River. Whether this second trial physically happened or whether it was simply a metaphorical decree, the truth remains clear. The hatred of these men transcended sanity. The legacy of Formosus was a battleground that consumed the minds of the most powerful men in the world, dragging the entire Catholic Church into an era so corrupt, so unbelievably depraved, that historians later named it the pornocracy, the rule of the harlots.
Today, if you walk through the glittering golden halls of the Vatican, you will see magnificent statues of saints, glorious frescoes painted by Michelangelo, and the polished marble tombs of the popes. It is a place of serene, untouchable holiness. But beneath those polished floors, beneath the layers of Renaissance beauty, the blood and the madness of the 9th century are baked into the very foundations of the city. The Catholic Church successfully burned almost every official document regarding the Cadaver Synod. They desperately tried to erase Pope Stephen VI's horrific crime from the history books, but they failed. Because a terror that profound leaves a stain that cannot be scrubbed away. We are left to wonder about the fundamental nature of hatred. How deeply must you despise a human being to rob them of the peace of the grave? What kind of dark, festering rot must exist in a man's soul to look upon a decomposing corpse, a fragile, rotting vessel returning to the earth, and feel nothing but a desire to inflict pain upon it? The Cadaver Synod forces us to confront a terrifying reality about the institutions we trust. The men who claim to speak for the divine, the men who hold the keys to heaven and hell, are still just men. They are vulnerable to the same paranoia, the same violent ambition, and the same creeping madness that infects us all. Pope Formosus died on April 4, 8896. He won the game of life, but his enemies made sure he lost the game of death. So the next time you stand at the edge of a cemetery, listening to the wind rustle through the quiet trees, looking at the heavy stones meant to keep the dead safely in the earth, remember the true story of Pope Formosus. Remember that the grave is only a sanctuary if the living allow it to be. And if your enemies are powerful enough and their hatred is deep enough, not even death can save you.